The Bible has two main divisions, the Old Testament and the New Testament. The word testament means covenant and refers to how God deals with human beings. We now live under the New Covenant, or the New Testament. There are many covenants in the Old Testament that define our relationship with God. But essentially, the Old Testament tells us about God and the world we live in, who He is, what He is like, His attributes and His character, how human beings can approach Him, and how they are to live their lives. God is the creator of the world. He's the ruler of the world. He is all-knowing, all-powerful, and everywhere present. He is holy. Human beings cannot see His face or exist in His presence. Human beings need to approach God through blood sacrifices, which may not make complete sense until the New Testament. In the New Testament, everything changes. Everything about a human being's relationship with God. And this all begins with the coming of Jesus. Matthew is the first book of the New Testament and tells us the first chapter in this new story. The question may be asked, well, there are 4 Gospels. Is this actually the first in the logical sequence? Is this Gospel first in our Bibles because it is the earliest written, a random decision, or because this is the best introduction to the life and teaching of Jesus? The answer? My answer is that the book of Matthew is the best introduction to the New Testament. Mark is an abbreviated version which lacks the depth of Matthew. Luke is written almost as a commentary on the other Gospels. He sees what the others say and words and such as to give it a better understanding. John focuses on who Jesus is more than on an overall view of His teaching and ministry. So let's look at the book of Matthew. Matthew 1:1. The record of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Starting a book with a genealogy seems unusual, at least in modern minds. I mean, in modern books, you want something that grabs somebody's attention. But this genealogy is important to Matthew for 2 reasons, which we will look at shortly. But we need to ask if genealogy is the best translation of this word in this context. Any person familiar with the Bible in Matthew's time would know that these opening words are from the book of Genesis, and that is where we need to look to understand them. We also need to know that the New Testament was originally written in Greek, and the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. But about 300 years before the time of Christ, the Bible, the Old Testament, was translated into Greek, and this Greek Old Testament, called a Septuagint, was the common Bible of the early church. Greek was as common then around the world of the Bible as English is today. We will refer to this Greek Old Testament a lot in our study on Matthew. Genealogy. Now this Greek word and this usage occurs frequently in the book of Genesis. And Matthew's readers would have recognized this connection immediately. In fact, these exact words appear twice in Genesis 2:24 and 5:1. The Hebrew word it translates as Toledoth, which means generations, or like in the account of a man and his descendants. It may or may not give a detailed genealogy, like in Genesis 37, with the story of Joseph. This is the genealogy of Jacob, and it just gives us the story of Joseph. So it's not necessarily or primarily a genealogy as such. I've listed here, you can see all the time just uses Genesis. Sometimes it lists genealogy, and just as often it doesn't. Genesis 2:4. This is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created. Now this word account is the Greek word that is used in Matthew for genealogy. Matthew 5:1. This is the book of the generations of Adam. The word generations here is the same word as genealogy in Matthew 1. Now there's a genealogy that is given, but in Genesis 2:4 is not. Genesis 6:9. These are the generations of Noah. Same word as in genealogies, but it's not a genealogy here. It's the story of Noah and the ark. And you can go through these other verses as well here. And the Greek word is not an exact equivalent to the Hebrew. It can mean generation, offspring, the birth, and so on. So like in the Old Testament, it's like the book of the generation of heaven and earth. But as we said, these opening words of Matthew's gospel are found twice in the book of Genesis. Genesis 2:4, where it says, "This is the account of the heavens and the earth." And Genesis 5:1, this is the book of the generations of Adam. So this expression, book of the genealogy, or even just the word genealogy, primarily addressed a person's history, which might include a genealogy. So as is the case here. So while Matthew begins his book with the genealogy, his book is an account of the life of Jesus. It begins with his ancestry. This is important first to establish who Jesus was. So as a translation, you can say, better to say this book, this is the account of the life of Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus the Christ, the son of Abraham, son of David. The name Jesus itself, and this is the Greek translation of the Hebrew word Joshua. Yes, the same Joshua in the Bible. In fact, in the Greek Old Testament, the name Jesus appears where the word Joshua appears. The name means the Lord is salvation, or simply salvation, where Lord is God's name. God's name is, I have it printed here, YHWH in Hebrew. Nobody really knows how to pronounce it. Most Bible teachers today would probably say Yahweh. Some people say Jehovah, but nobody really knows. Most English Bibles just say Lord, but they use all capital letters. A lot of Hebrew names begin with God's name. Probably any Hebrew name in the Bible beginning with a J or an I is one of them. It's probably a combination of God's name doing something. In the Greek Old Testament, as he said, the name Jesus translates the name Joshua. Now Christ is not Jesus' last name. The word Christ means anointed one, and is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Mashiach, or Messiah. So when you see the name Jesus Christ, it's literally like Jesus the Messiah, Jesus the anointed one. God had promised the Messiah, or the anointed one, in the Old Testament to be the Savior of Israel and then the whole world. The word occurs 16 times in Matthew, and each time it is focused on the Messiah rather than on Jesus. In the transcript, I list all the various verses here. We won't look at these now, but we'll keep this in mind when we come to these passages. This Messiah will be a descendant of David, the second king of Israel. So Matthew begins his gospel, the genealogy, to show that Jesus was indeed a descendant of David. Now it says here that the son of David, the son of Abraham. Well, if he was the son of David, he was automatically a son of Abraham. But Matthew takes this genealogy back to Abraham. Why? Because there are 4 particular people in Jesus' line, 3 of whom would have been missed if he had started the genealogy with David. These 4 people are all women. Women aren't included in normal genealogies, only the fathers. But Matthew wants you to know about 4 women who are in Jesus' ancestral line. He has a good reason, which we will soon see. Now, just a little note here in genealogies. They were important in ancient Israel because the inheritances were passed through the fathers. Some people will wonder why this was so. I will offer my explanations. Families often had multiple wives and hence multiple mothers. That would make for a genealogical nightmare. But the only common thread in all of them would be the father. Throughout all of human history, men and women were roughly born in even proportion. But the ratio favors women for most of the rest of their lives. Why? More men died in wars than women. You read the Old Testament, wars were a common thing in olden times. Pretty much throughout human history. More men die in wars than women, and wars have always been with us. Men tend to work in more dangerous occupations and live riskier lives. If men only had one wife, many women would never marry and have children, and they would die alone. This was never considered a good thing in Bible days. Nowadays, people start thinking differently, but does that make it right? I don't know. But the second reason, if men were not expected to take the leadership roles in society and in families, most or many men would not do it. The last thing you want in a society is mothers where the fathers are unknown or uncertain. Children would not grow up with a father, and that was considered serious. So the four women mentioned in Jesus' genealogy are Tamar. Her story is found in Genesis 38. Judah, who was a descendant of Jesus, one of the patriarchs he was descended from Jacob, one of the patriarchs of Israel and Jesus' ancestor. His son married Tamar. He died. His brother took him as a wife, and he died soon after. And after Judah's wife died, Tamar tricked Judah into having sexual relations with her, and she bore two sons, one of whom is in Jesus' genealogy. Okay. The second woman is Rahab. Her story is in Joshua chapter 2. When the Israelites came to the Promised Land after leaving Egypt, they sent out two spies to explore the city of Jericho and the surrounding region. Rahab was a harlot who befriended them and hid them from the authorities who were looking for them. She knew that God was with Israel, and she asked for them to deal kindly with her and her family in reward for her help. Then there was Ruth. Her story is in the book of Ruth. Ruth was a foreign woman who married into an Israelite family while they were staying in her country. Her husband died, and she returned to Israel with her mother-in-law. She there married Boaz, who is in the land of Christ. But she was a foreigner who was forbidden to be a part of Israel. And then there was Bathsheba. Her story is in 2 Samuel 11. This is the only woman who would have been noted if Matthew had begun the genealogy with David, and the only woman not mentioned here by name. Some English Bibles name her, but Matthew didn't. Why not? Probably because she belonged to another man, and Matthew wants us to be aware of the seriousness of her situation. She committed adultery with King David. We don't know if she was a willing participant here. I suppose she could have refused the king. I'm not sure that was something you would want to do, but technically, yes, she was guilty of adultery. Soon Matthew will introduce another woman accused of adultery, and her he does name, because the charge was false. Although nobody would believe otherwise, but she was engaged to her future husband. Only he would know that he was not the real father. So in Tamar, there was an unlawful union. Leviticus 18:15 says, "You shall not uncover the nakedness of your daughter-in-law." She's your son's wife. Though true, her husbands were dead, as well as Judah's wife, but still, she was his daughter-in-law. In Rahab, there's an unholy woman. Leviticus 19:29. Do not profane your daughter by making her a harlot, so that the land will not fall to harlotry. In Ruth, there's a forbidden foreigner. Deuteronomy 23:3. No Ammonite or Moabite shall enter the assembly of the Lord. None of their descendants, even to the 10th generation. But she was admitted. In Bathsheba, there's an adulterous woman. Leviticus 20, verse 10. There's a man who commits adultery with another man's wife, one who commits adultery with his friend's wife. The adulterer and the adulteress shall surely be put to death. Now we come to Mary, a woman pregnant while engaged to be married, but not by her intended. Matthew 1:18-25. Okay. Verse 18, now the birth of Jesus Christ was as follows. When his mother Mary had been betrothed to Joseph, before they came together, she was found to be with child by the Holy Spirit. Luke's gospel gives an account of this, but Matthew doesn't. We could refer constantly to the other gospels when they share different details, but for Matthew, I think we should tell the story just as he does. When we do Luke, we'll compare the other gospel accounts where we needed. In Luke, we would have learned that Mary spent 3 months visiting her cousin Elizabeth, who was to be the mother of John the Baptist. So it would have been when she returned that her pregnancy would have been discovered. She had been visited by an angel when she apparently didn't tell Joseph about this. And Joseph, her husband, being a righteous man and not wanting to disgrace her, planned to send her away secretly. This is the law that pertained to her situation. Oh, it's a lot of verses here. But anyhow, okay, if a man is found lying with a married woman, okay, here, if there's a girl who's a virgin engaged to a man, another man finds her in the city and lies with her, then you shall bring them both out to the gate of that city, and you shall stone them to death. The girl because she did not cry out in the city, and the man because he has violated his neighbor's wife. Thus you shall purge the evil from among you. But if in the field the man finds the girl who's engaged, and the man forces her and lies with her, then only the man who lies with her shall die. But you shall do nothing to the girl. There's no sin in the girl worthy of death, for just as a man rises against his neighbor and murders him, so is this case. When he found her in the field, the engaged girl cried out, but there's no one to save her. So technically, yeah, Joseph could have had Mary stoned to death. Of course, then people wouldn't believe who's the father, whatever. The text says that Joseph, her husband, was a righteous man, and therefore he planned to just send her away secretly. If Joseph were a different person, he could have had Mary stoned for adultery. He just wanted her to just go her own way. The text says that because he was a righteous man was why he did this. Now, there's a note here. I won't go through it because it's very technical. If you have the transcript, you can read it if you wish. Where he would translate this word righteous as kindly, because Joseph was a kindly man. He wasn't willing to make her a public example. Verse 20. But when he had considered this, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for the child who was conceived in her is of the Holy Spirit. Now, the two Greek words for dreams, Matthew uses the less frequent one, which emphasizes a vision in the sleep. Now, 6 times in the book of Matthew, dreams are mentioned, and to 3 different people. 5 times God spoke through them, but all were important, and the person who had the dreams recognized dreams as being important. Look at all the mentions of dreams in the Bible, and all were significant. Abimelech, Genesis 20. Jacob, Genesis 31. Laban, Genesis 31. Joseph, Genesis 37. Pharaoh's servant, Genesis 40. Pharaoh, Genesis 41. Some prophets, Numbers 12. A Midianite, Judges 7. Saul, 1 Samuel 28. Solomon, 1 Kings 3. Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel 2. Daniel 4. Daniel himself, Daniel chapter 7. Old men in the last days, Joel 2. Joseph, he had 4 times. Is it 4 times? 1, 2, 3, 4 times in Matthew. He gets a dream. The Magi who come later get a dream, and Pilate's wife. So dreams are important in the Bible, and so they're important in our lives today. Many of the dreams of the Bible needed to be interpreted by somebody else, God's man, and those were some of the most significant ones. One dream was forgotten by the person who had it, but he really wanted to know what it meant, and God revealed it to him through Daniel the prophet. That dream turned out to have God's plan for the ages spelled out for humankind. People dream every night, and in most cases never give it a moment's thought. And many of these dreams, God actually spoke to somebody. We need to be more aware that this is an important means of God communicating to human beings. I stopped using alarm clocks a very long time ago so that I would wake up naturally and better able to remember my dreams. Verse 21, and she will bear a son. You shall call his name Jesus. For he, is emphasized, will save his people from their sins. Now, names are often significant in the Bible. Names are often given to relate to the events of their births, sometimes prophetically of the child's future, as in the case of Jesus. His name was to be Jesus because that is who he is. Jesus in Hebrew is Yeshua. It means salvation, or Yahweh. we mentioned about the Hebrew names beginning with a Y is usually referring to God's name, the abbreviation for God. I have some technical notes here. I won't go through them in a video here. And it says that Jesus will save the people from their sins. It doesn't say that Jesus will save them from the penalty of their sins, but from their sins itself. That means everything, the penalty of sins, the power of sins, the guilt of sins. Certainly saving his people from their sins involves his death on the cross as an atonement. Yet Matthew uses the word sozo, this is the word save in Greek, in other contexts throughout the book. This suggests to me that salvation from sins means a lot more than just Jesus dying to pay the penalty of them. It suggests that many of the things we suffer in life are in some ways consequences of sin, and saving us from sins includes delivering us from these other things as well. Look at Matthew chapter 9. We'll get to it in more detail when we get to it. And a woman who had been suffering from a hemorrhage for 12 years came up behind Jesus, and touched the fringe of his cloak. For she was saying to herself, if I only touch his garments, I will get well. Literally is, I will be saved. But Jesus, turning and seeing her, said, daughter, take courage, your faith has made you well. Your faith has saved you. And at once the woman was made well. Literally, the woman was saved. And there's another technical notes here. I just, when you get the transcript, you can read that. Okay, verse 22. Now all this took place to fulfill what was spoken by the Lord through the prophets. Behold, the virgin is with child, and shall bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which translated means God with us. Isaiah 7:14 is the prophecy where this was spoken. Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin will be with child and bear a son, and she shall call his name Emmanuel. Some people have complained that the Hebrew word used here in Isaiah does not explicitly mean virgin. There's another word for that, a Bethulah. The Hebrew word in Isaiah 7:14 is Alma, which is a young woman. One young woman who's not a child. She's reached puberty. Okay, the lexicon here says ripe sexually, a maid or newly married. So it's a young woman, but it emphasizes the fact that she is, able to be married, able to have children. But we must realize two things here. Number one, Hebrew culture was not like modern Western culture. They didn't have sexually active middle schoolers or a lot of older unmarried women who would have been with men. When a person reached puberty, it was time to start thinking about getting married. Pretty much everybody got married. If you weren't a virgin when you did, you could have a real problem. So the fact that Isaiah 7:14 says a young woman is only emphasizing the fact that this is a young woman, but is assumed very strongly that she would be unmarried or a virgin. In the context of Isaiah 14, it seems to apply to a real person who was married, a young woman. But we mentioned about the Greek translations of the Old Testament. The Greek translation of the Old Testament that Matthew uses generally, and other New Testament writers, the word is clearly virgin, parthenos. So Matthew changes the verb you shall call his name to they shall call his name, suggesting to me that they were seeing God at work in their midst. Jesus is God with us. When we see Jesus, we see him acting out what God's presence means in our lives. Healing, calming the storm, feeding the 5,000, and raising the dead. Matthew 1:24-25. And Joseph rose from his sleep and did as the angel of the Lord commanded him, and took his wife, and was not knowing her until she gave birth to a son, and he called his name Jesus. Roman Catholics believe that Mary continued as a virgin her whole life. Any Catholic author will show verses that show in their mind that Matthew is not here saying anything about Mary's life after she had a child. I submit that if Mary indeed remained a virgin until she died, Matthew would have said so instead of wording it as he did. In this case, in these verses, says that Joseph took Mary as his wife. Anyone would have assumed that he and his wife had relations when he did so. And Matthew's comment here is only that they didn't do this until she gave birth.